Welcome to my humble abode. I'm Yoki the Tail Spinner, and this Tales Over Coffee. We start the day together with a narrative tale and a cup of coffee. We return now to Ukraine war stories, where our two teenagers, Yerek and Vika, have been separated as Russians have kidnapped Vika. Yerek's gone to his neighbour, who sold the locals out to the Russians, thinking they were just after nationalists. And he's being disbelieved as to what happened. I wanted to throw up. I know what I saw, I said, squeezing my fist. Stupid bastard, looking me in the eye and saying things like that. They had their way with her, and they took her with them. And they're doing God knows what to her over there. But Russians aren't like that. Now Americans see, now they would. Have you seen what the Americans did to Iraq? I wanted to scream. Every second I wasted with him, Vika was suffering. But I had to persevere. The Russians wouldn't keep her for long, and they would not escape unpunished. Meanwhile, Husky continued. A Russian officer's honor, you can't begin to understand. You are too young. They won't move a hair on your sister's head. Yeah. Not the hair on her head you should be worried about, you bastard. Burn in hell. Yes, they will. I want my sister back. If they are such nice people, why are they holding her? I needed to convince him somehow and quickly. Show him my injuries. Officer's honor. What about this? I lifted up my shirt and showed Husky my stomach, all blue and sickly yellow with bruises. Who do you think did this? Who's genuinely thrown? Oh my, who did that to you? I could not believe my eyes. The Russians did! I've been telling you for the last hour or so! His eyes glazed over and we sat in silence for a while. No, an officer, a new one. After rotation, I will talk to him. Invite him for some drinks tonight, he shrugged. Maybe when they are in a good mood. I'm sure this was a misunderstanding. Can I throttle him? I didn't want to believe he spent as long as I did in occupied Bucha, yet stayed so ignorant. But as long as he was going to speak with the Russians, my visit wasn't useless. I'd be a fool to trust Husky's word, though. Instead of going home, I sat in a ruined house across the street. I needed to see the meeting happen. Very soon, Husky went somewhere and returned accompanied by several soldiers. He invited them in, then made a funny face when they didn't bother wiping their boots on the doormat. Perhaps if he himself lied down, they'd be more willing. I left my hiding spot and skulked closer to the house for a better view. The Russians he invited set up in the kitchen, and Husky brought out the glasses and bottle of russet drink. Then another, when the soldiers called him a cheapskate. Once the drink started flowing, the Russians did loosen up. So what did you want to talk about? You want the town for yourself? The officer chuckled. Become the administrator? The rest of the soldiers laughed, calling Husky a Galeta? Not sure. No, the locals are already bringing their complaints to me. He didn't mention me by name, but he told them told soldiers my story. He was proud to do so. He probably expected them to immediately debunk it. The Russian officer just smiled and exchanged a quick glance with his soldiers. Husky, mind your own business, you fat fuck, okay? You were doing so well. Husky's eyes went red with rage. I'm old enough to be your father. How dare you speak to me like that? Blam. A bright flash, a shell casing blinking off the kitchen table, and the thud of a collapsing body. I froze in place with my eyes closed, my heart thumping in my ears, sucking in air so I wouldn't suffocate. Oh, come on, I heard clumsy footsteps. Indoors? My ear's ringing. Fuck. Did anyone catch where he got the booze from? One of the drawers, right? I backed away from the window, then through the ruined fence, then I ran. His mood's up, but I don't think it would be after that incident. Missed calls from Mum, 70. I kept thinking about Vika for the next few days. I knew I couldn't negotiate with Russians. Husky tried already. They killed a man who spent his whole life promoting the Russian world. What would they do to me? And one day, I overheard some people talking as they cooked breakfast over a campfire. Soon there was to be an evacuation from Bucha. I imagined myself leaving the nightmare I was trapped in for the last few weeks. I could see Mum coming out to meet me. I could see myself finally falling asleep without worrying I'd wake up. Something to strive for. But Vika? You wanted to be a grown-up, Yorick? Here's your grown-up choice. And nobody to ask for guidance. I was getting swarmed by memories of Vika, helping me with homework, supporting me when we found out Mum and Dad had divorced. Always caring, always kind. What was I supposed to do? I always play narrative games according to, and I've said this many times now on the channel, how the story develops and how I see the characters. I don't see him not trying to free Vika. I don't see him not trying to free her at all. I don't think it'll work. I don't see him not trying. And honestly, in a situation like this, do you have any choice? The longer I thought, the more I realised I couldn't leave Vika alone. I had to break her out, even if it would be the last thing I did in my life. First of all, I needed a plan. I've seen their headquarters. I could guess how many Russians were guarding it, but I didn't know their patrol schedule. I needed more information. I decided to take a close look at the house where the Russians took Vika. That was a big mistake. I wasn't sneaky enough to hide from a trained military. The sentries noticed me. They called me over, with one of them pointing his rifle at me. There was nowhere to run. I tried to make up an excuse. They didn't believe me. One of them bashed me to the ground with a rifle. They tied my hands and dragged me to their headquarters. I couldn't see, and my head was spinning. As they dragged me to the basement, I passed out. Yeah, I'm not surprised the mood is down. Missed calls from Mum 120. I woke up, my eyes hurt at first, but I could hear and smell things again, and the place I was in smelled terrible, like sweat, vomit, and human waste. I opened my eyes to look around. Bad idea. I was on a dirty mattress inside a dark and cramped room with no windows. The only light source was a dim light bulb over a heavy metal door, and I wasn't the only one in the room. There were about 10 men in total here. Different ages and clothing, some in camouflage, some in jeans, some even in tracksuits. It felt like a completely random gathering of people, but they all had something in common. They were all beat up. Some were unmoving, others talked quietly among themselves. Nobody noticed me. I tried to sit up. My head was spinning at first, but ultimately, I think I wasn't as hurt as I thought. I wanted to ask if anyone knew where we were when the door creaked open. 2 Russians walked in. They brought a man in bloodied shirt with them, and he threw him to the floor. He didn't move. Only his ragged, raspy breathing indicated he was still alive. Meanwhile, the soldiers grabbed another prisoner, a gaunt, middle-aged man, and dragged him toward the exit. He didn't resist. I think he knew it was futile. The door closed with a metal clang. A few minutes later, there was already screaming from behind it. Sometimes it was broken by loud swearing and muffled sounds of punching. The realization made me sweat. The Russians detained me in one of their basements. After 8 years of war, everybody knew what Russian basement meant. A torture chamber. Russian patsies in Donbass put everyone they didn't like in those basements, from political activists to uncooperative civilians. And sometimes it was just a way to force someone to part with his business. All kinds of things happened in those basements. Torture, humiliation, executions. And now I found myself in the basement too. I shuddered from every yelp coming from behind the doors. Eventually they got quieter and quieter. Soon there was no sound at all, at least for a while. Then a deafening bang, a point-blank gunshot. I was shaking. The guy who came before me was beaten to a pulp, then finished off. This couldn't be happening, not in the 21st century. Then the door opened again, and now the Russians were looking at me. They grabbed me and dragged me toward the exit. I was paralyzed with fear. I've never felt sheer terror like that in my life. I was too scared to fight back, and what could I do against armed soldiers? For a moment I even thought they could go easy on me if I told them what they wanted to hear. Of course, that was a silly thing to hope for. They would only go easy on me if they chose so. They dragged me to a small room, not unlike the previous one, except for a chair standing in the middle, and on the wall nearby a blood splatter, so fresh it was still bright red and wet. The soldiers tied me to the chair and stood by the entrance. Another Russian entered, an officer. He seemed completely indifferent. That was until he saw me. If it isn't our hero, we're going to have a little talk, find out who you are and where you're from. He slowly circled me, then jabbed me in the chest. I doubled over, coughing, and tried to draw breath. My eyes got wet. We'll be here a long time, buddy. You'll tell me everything. By the time I'm done, you'll sell out your own mother. Just so I'd stop. The Russians started asking questions I had no answers for. About Nazis, partisans, Ukraine military, checkpoints. And when I told him I knew nothing, he hit me again, and again. Must have thought I was lying. And he didn't like it at all. They'll know if we try and lie. We don't have the mood to do this. They're both going to drop the mood, so I think this is going to be the end of this run, but... Tell them about Vika. I held out for some time, but with every new hit, my resolve faded. Then, instead of using his fists, the Russian took a metal rod. 2 crushed fingers was all I could take. I talked. I told the Russians about my sister, the one they raped and took away. About Katya, also raped and killed. I just wanted to help someone I loved. He just kept beating me and asking about the Nazis. I don't know how long it lasted, but it felt like forever. I lost consciousness several times, but they'd wake up by dumping cold water over me, and it started all over again. I felt like bleeding mincemeat. The pain got so bad. Eventually, I checked out and couldn't hear the questions anymore. When I lost consciousness again, they dragged me back to the cell. I woke up on the same dirty mattress as before. By now, that mattress felt like home. I was convinced that basement would be the last thing I would ever see. I was wrong. This calls from 154. We have 0 mood, but I guess we can't do anything like a hero in the first story because, well, we're captives. The bag on my head smelled like rust. It was damp on the side, and my head was pounding, coming apart. There used to be a warm trickle down my temple and the side of my neck, but it's long since dried up. I couldn't stop shaking. Some hero I turned out to be. Oh, you're a hero, Yannick, you tried. A hero doesn't mean you succeed, it means you try against the odds. Back in the basement, the Russians came in and put everyone on their feet. They blindfolded us with scotch tape and took us to move. Up the stairs into the yard toward the rumbling engine of a truck. They were putting us on a truck. That's when my legs gave out. I couldn't walk. I knew how this was going to end. I'd heard the stories. Either they'd drive us forward as their meat shields, or ship us to Belarus as prisoners, or... Someone nearby started pleading, "Don't do this, you don't have to do this, I didn't do anything. You don't have to do this." They didn't have to do any of it. But they chose to. So I told myself I wouldn't beg. I was the man of the house, I wouldn't beg, but my legs gave out all the same. Can't imagine how terrifying it must be. The Russians threw me in a truck anyway. And someone fell on top of me and all I could smell was sweat and rust and vomit. I was choking back tears. My mind went to Vika, and I just hoped she was alright, even if I failed to do enough. I was in a haze when the truck finally stopped. They pulled us to the ground like we were crates. My arm exploded with pain, but it was dulled. If I had cracked a bone, it barely registered. Get up! Get up! Walk! Whenever I was too slow, I got a prod or a kick for it. We didn't wait for too long. Eventually, they put us on our knees. Then we heard shovels. Someone among us spat on the ground, end of the line. Someone next to me gulped loudly. Someone else swore under his breath, cursing the Russians. Someone with a calm old man's voice started to pray. I expected there to be more begging, more tears, and a deep part of me was glad there wasn't. But I think the adults simply knew too well how this was going to end. I'm not sure I knew. I wasn't an adult yet. I just really didn't want to die. That's when the sound of shoveling stopped. No, 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 no! I don't see how any of these have got a good ending. But how could a 15-year-old not be in denial in the amount of terror he's bound to be facing? They weren't going to shoot me. They weren't going to shoot any one of us. He used to tell me stories of this sort of thing. Mock executions to freak you out. Sometimes this was an interrogation technique. Sometimes this was simply the Russians' idea of fun. I didn't want to think about it too much. Maybe I should have. But either way, either this was a mock execution, and so it didn't matter, or it wasn't. And in that case, at least I wouldn't let them scare me. When I heard the gun safety click, it was really hard not to be scared. Mom. No change in parameters. This way, please. The man in white scrubs opened the morgue's door before the pale woman in military uniform looked exhausted. Shadows under her faded eyes. Shaky hands holding a handkerchief soaked with tears. Yana. Bright white lights, white tiles, white sheets covering the deceased. Yana tried not to look around as she walked behind the guide. She was a doctor. She had seen plenty of deaths by now. She had lost patients, sometimes under enemy shellings. But death was never so close to her and so personal. Yana would hate white for the rest of her life. If she was a believer, she'd probably be praying. She had no faith left after so many days of treating boys not much older than her son. Boys torn apart by bullets and shrapnel, losing limbs left and right. They say there are no atheists in the foxholes, but for Yana, it was the war that took her faith away. The realization that survival depended on discipline rather than prayers, and that sometimes life was governed by pure blind luck, and it didn't spare the believers any more than the rest. Then she went to Bucha, and she couldn't understand how people could do something like that. People, Christians, brotherly nation. She lost communication with her children when the occupation had just begun. When she found a summer house in Bucha empty, and none of her local friends were alive, she knew Yarek and Vika were as good as dead. But then she got a call from a hospital, asking her to come in and identify 2 bodies. Yana was terrified. It was she who sent the children to Bucha. Further from the war, she thought. And everything that's happened to them since was her fault. Meanwhile, the doctor directed her to their destination, the autopsy room. With a heavy heart, Yana stepped inside. Whenever you're ready. Yana nodded. How could she possibly be ready for such a thing? What a fucking stupid thing you could say. Ready. She kept holding out that these weren't her children and the real Vika and Yannick were still out there, hiding. They would be found. With a deep sigh, Yana motioned for the doctor to go on. He pulled back the sheets. And the world stood still. Then shattered into a million pieces. She recognized her children immediately. Yana couldn't remember how she ended up outside. She just realized eventually that she was on a bench next to a hospital. She was shaking. Her children's faces were still before her eyes. Then the memories came in which Vika and Yannick were still alive. For the first time in her life, Yana considered suicide. Weakness? Perhaps. She had nobody left who needed her strength. Yannick and Vika were buried in Bucha, on the cemetery set up for the victims. The rows of freshly dug graves seemed endless to Yana, and all she could hear was the crying of all those who gathered here. She had too much of her own grief to deal with. Staring at children's faces in their coffins, she couldn't believe her eyes. She wished they would open their eyes, smile, and tell her they were okay. This was all a big misunderstanding. What she wouldn't give for that to be the truth. There used to be three of them, Yana, Vika, and Yannick, together against the whole world. Now Yana was all alone. Maybe one day she would get used to it, unlikely as that seemed. Epilogue. Bucha was among the first towns hit by the Russian troops when the Russian invasion of Ukraine began on February 24, 2022. After a week of fighting, the Russians captured Bucha on March 5, 2022, and were fully beaten back on March 31, 2022. What took place during the Russian occupied is now considered genocide. As of June, 412 dead had been confirmed, buried in mass graves or left in the streets. According to the local authorities, more than 85% of the victims died from gunshot wounds, suggesting the killings were deliberate and intentional. Crimes committed against civilians' population, including summary execution, torture, looting and rape. Evidence suggested that children were not spared. Bucha became emblematic of the Russian occupation, but it is far from the only town where genocide took place. As of June 2022, the Russian-occupied territories of Ukraine, including the cities of Kherson, Mariupol, violence continues unabated. The end of the war is not in sight. As of September 2023, it still isn't. But Ukraine is fighting back hard. Well, that's the end of that one. There is one more, which is Mariupol. Sorry if you don't like seeing an old man cry. Hit the like, comment, subscribe if you want the channel to grow. Good to each other.